The Great Ecclesiastical Conspiracy by George Davis and Michael Clark. Copyright 2002. In Search of a City, Vision Publishing. Chapter 1. The King's New Bible. James also developed a dislike for the Geneva Bible, which was widely read and promoted by the Puritans. At that time it was in fact the most popular Bible in England. James's disdain for the Geneva Bible was not so much due to the translation itself, but primarily because of its marginal notes that promoted the notion that all believers comprised the New Testament priesthood, and that they, not the king, were God's anointed. The Geneva Bible notes on Psalm 105:14 and 15 read, Psalm 105:14, He suffered no man to do them wrong, yea, he reproved kings for their sakes. In the note, G, that is, the king of Egypt and the king of Gerar. Psalm 105:15, saying, Touch not mine anointed, and do my prophets no harm. In the notes, those whom I have sanctified to be my people, meaning the old fathers to whom God showed himself plainly and who set forth his word. The anointed that should not be touched were not kings. In fact, God reproved kings for their sake. The anointed consists of all those whom God has sanctified to be his people, not a king or a special breed of ruling ministers. The Geneva Bible notes on Luke 22:24 reads, And there was also a strife among them, which of them should be accounted the greatest. And the note says, The pastors are not called to rule, but to serve. Gary DeMar comments further, quote, In 1620 the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth with their Bibles, and a conviction derived from those Bibles of establishing a new nation. The Bible was not the King James Version. When James I became King of England in 1603, there were two translations of the Bible in use. The Geneva Bible was the most popular, and the Bishop's Bible was used for reading in churches. End quote. King James disapproved of the Geneva Bible because of its Calvinistic leanings. He also frowned on what he considered to be seditious marginal notes on key political texts. A marginal note for Exodus 1:9 indicated that the Hebrew midwives were correct in disobeying the Egyptian king's orders, and a note for 2 Chronicles 15:16 said that King Asa should have had his mother executed and not merely deposed for the crime of worshiping an idol. The King James Version of the Bible grew out of the king's distaste for these brief but potent doctrinal commentaries. He considered the marginal notes to be a political threat to his kingdom. Quote, At a conference at Hampton Court in 1604, with bishops and theologians, the king listened to a suggestion by the Puritan scholar John Reynolds that a new translation of the Bible was needed. Because of his distaste for the Geneva Bible, James was eager for a new translation. I profess, he said, I could never yet see a Bible well translated in English, but I think that, of all, that of Geneva is the worst. End quote. The Geneva Bible, the Forgotten Translation by Gary DeMar. This helps us to better understand why the Geneva Bible was so despised by King James. It is not an overstatement to say that much of James's conduct as King of England was reactionary, done to counter an unacceptable turn toward egalitarianism. There is little doubt in our minds but that a clandestine scheme lay at the heart of James's decision to translate his new Bible. After James came to England and was crowned king, a bishop by the name of Richard Bancroft, soon to become archbishop, sought to save the church and the nation of England from the Puritan false prophets. Bancroft was aware of James's exalted view of kingship and used that knowledge to promote his own agenda. In presenting the Puritans as a threat to the crown, Bancroft solicited the king's help in suppressing this greatest threat to his position and power, and in so doing made himself the highest authority in the Church of England, second only to the king himself. There can be little doubt but that the true motive behind Bancroft's intrigue was a desire to preserve the power of the unbiblical bishopric. Alistair McGrath explains Bancroft's strategy. Quote, Bancroft's strategy for coping with James was simple. He would persuade James that the monarchy was dependent upon the episcopacy. Without bishops there was no future for the monarchy in England. End quote. In the beginning, page 152. This political cunning played a significant role in the decision to translate a new Bible, an authorized version that would make all other versions unauthorized. From all appearances, the new translation was a calculated initial step toward ridding England of the despised Geneva Bible and its marginal notes. This new Bible would preserve and promote the divine right of kings and bishops to rule. Bishop Bancroft was placed in charge of the translation. This move was akin to a CEO entrusting the company finances to a known embezzler. There is little doubt that Bancroft stacked the translation panel with a goodly number of translators who shared his views. Mr. McGrath explains, quote, A further point that helped win Bancroft over to the new translation was that he was able to secure for himself a leading personal role in selecting the translators, and then in limiting their freedom. Bancroft had realized that it was better to create a new official translation that he could influence than to have to contend with the authorization of the Geneva Bible. It was decidedly the lesser of two evils. He was in a position to exercise considerable influence over the new Bible by laying rules of translation that would ensure that it would be sympathetic to the position and sensitivities of the established Church of England. And finally, he would be in a position to review the final text of the translation in case it needed any judicious changes before publication." End quote. In the beginning, page 164. Determined to ensure that the translation process was prudently guided, Bancroft limited the freedom of the translators by drafting 15 rules of translation, which were approved by King James. 2 of these rules are of special importance. Number 1, the ordinary Bible read in the church, commonly called the Bishop's Bible, was to be followed and as little altered as the truth of the original will permit. Number 3, the old ecclesiastical words were to be kept, vis-a-vis the word church not to be translated congregation. The Bishop's Bible was a revision of the Great Bible, which was expressly translated in hopes of replacing the Geneva Bible. Archbishop Matthew Parker commissioned this revision. A company of bishops did the translating, thus the name the Bishop's Bible. Archbishop Parker faced considerable opposition from the Puritans for his insistence upon the use of robes and his writings that held to the old line. Ironically, the Bishop's Bible, which until that time had been ineffective in accomplishing its original purpose of replacing the Geneva Bible, would now, in the hands of another ambitious bishop, be used to that very end. In order to preserve their precious power base, King James and Bishop Bancroft took a giant step backwards in order to negate the Tyndale, Coverdale, and Geneva Bibles. Rule number 3 was clearly designed to ensure that Tyndale's translation of the Greek word ecclesia as congregation instead of church would not be used in the King's New Bible. Tyndale had translated the Greek word ecclesia as congregation and revealed his contempt for the word church by using the word churches in Acts 19:37 to refer to heathen temples. Could he have been trying to tell us something? Clearly, an accurate translation was not the objective of Bancroft and his team. As if that were not enough, when the translation was complete, Bancroft took the final draft into his home and further altered it before giving it over to the king to be published. Alister McGrath explains, quote, "Having completed the recommendations for revision of the work of the translators of the King's New Bible, the text was passed on to Miles Smith and Thomas Bilson, who were charged with the adding of the finishing touches. It is not clear whether their role was to review the overall text of the translation or simply to comment on the specific changes proposed by the editorial committee that had met at Stationers' Hall. Then, in an apparently unscripted development, Richard Bancroft reviewed what had been hitherto regarded as the final version of the text. It would be one of his final acts. Bancroft died on November 2nd, 1610, and never lived to see the translation over which he had held so much sway, by order of the king. Smith complained loudly to anyone who would listen that Bancroft had introduced 14 changes in the final text without any consultation. Yet we remain unclear to what those alleged changes might have been." End quote. In the beginning, page 188. This is only a sample of the kind of political jockeying that was going on behind the scenes and the ambition that sponsored the translating, editing, and publication of the King's New Bible, which could not escape being tainted by such ambition. King James prohibited his translators from removing the old ecclesiastical words that had taken generations to weave into the text. He had to make a special emphasis in order to keep them, since any honest translator would have translated them out. Bancroft and King James intended to keep them no matter what the translators discovered. Quote, "I am convinced that the King James translators, laboring under an institutional church mentality, selected the strongest words possible which conveyed the idea that the people must submit to the authority of the clergy. In this way, King James could control the people through the church, of which he was supreme ruler." End quote. Dusty Owens, quote taken from "It Shall Not Be So Among You" by Norman Park.